On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the Black Sea Grain Initiative has been renewed. There was a bit of question whether or not Russia was going to renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Remember, the attack on Sevastopol by the unmanned surface and unmanned aerial vehicles caused Russia to pull out of the ship inspections, which raised the doubt whether or not Russia was going to allow the ships to continue to move back and forth from the Turkish Straits to Ukraine, load grain, and come back out. However, the issue Russia announced that was the problem was they were concerned that the grain route, this is the route that's been identified to be used by the ships, was being used to deploy the drones that attacked Sevastopol. Well, evidence came out that there was no vessels anywhere on that route at the time of the attacks. Ukraine said they did not use the grain routes for that. I think Russia ascertained that they were not using the grain routes. As a matter of fact, one of the stories we saw was a Russian attack on a tug and barge, a pair of tugs and barges that killed 2 Ukrainians, and thinking they may have been the assets being used. But Russia has not only gotten back into the grain deal, but they have renewed it now for another 120 days. This is the story here on the UN website talking about it, including a video here by the head of the UN.
Landed in Cairo on my way from the G20 summit in Bali to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. I was deeply moved to know that in Istanbul, Turkey, Ukraine, Russia and the UN had come to an agreement for the rollover of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, allowing for the free exports of Ukrainian grains. I want to express my deep commitment and the commitment of the UN to do everything possible for the smooth implementation of this agreement in Istanbul by the Joint Coordination Center, and also to remove the remaining obstacles to the unimpeded exports of Russian food and fertilizers, essential to avoid a food crisis next year.
All right, so a bit to unpack in there. So number one, obviously, one of the reciprocals of this agreement isn't just the export of Ukrainian grain, but the ability of Russia to export its food and its fertilizer. And I think that's a key aspect we keep forgetting here. At that conference I was just at, I had a slide where I talked about Russian defeats on the Black Sea, and they're numerous. I mean, Snake Island, the loss of the cruiser Moskva, the attack on the city of Berdansk and the destruction of a Russian logistics vessel, the attack on the Kerch Straits Bridge, and the recent attack on the port of Sevastopol. And I mentioned to these naval officers that while it appears that Russia is militarily losing on the Black Sea, economically they're not, because they're achieving their main goal, which is to get out their food and fertilizer. And that's the reciprocal of this grain deal. The Ukrainians have not been attacking Russian vessels. And more importantly, the UN and other forces have not stopped the export of this food and fertilizer and has opened up the Don, the Volga, and the Caspian to the Black Sea. Now, there's a couple of issues here that I think endanger this that we need to talk about. So first, let's look at the success of the grain deal as it currently stands. So what has been shipped? Well, I mean, you're seeing here the shipment of over 11 million tons of grain out of Ukraine. Now, again, that is significant. You sit here and go 11 million tons, Sal, that's a lot of grain, and it is a lot of grain. However, just real quick, Ukraine usually exports, like in August, September, October, about 6 million tons of grain a month. And so while Ukraine is getting grain out, they are not doing it at the levels that they have in the past. Should also note that while Ukraine grain is getting out, there's nothing coming in by sea. This is a big provision of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, is that you can't bring anything into Ukraine, and particularly fertilizer isn't coming in to get into the fields to be used for next year's planting. Containers, there hasn't been a container brought by ship into Ukraine since the start of this war. Yes, there's stuff coming over the border by road and by rail, but nowhere near the volume that you get from ship in there. So while Ukraine is exporting its crop, and a lot of this was already in silos and stored, the problem is going to be the next level. What happens when Ukraine needs to get food into the ground for next year. Don't forget, a lot of their personnel are now in the armies. A lot of their equipment is being used for that. Fields have been sown with mines and attacked. Infrastructure has been destroyed. The power outages are pronounced in Ukraine. So while Ukraine is getting out grain right now, the long-term aspect and prognosis of this is not good. Where the grain is going, we've talked about this before. 50% of the Ukrainian grain is going to 5 countries. And those 5 countries are Spain, Turkey, the Netherlands, Italy, and China. And granted, a lot of that grain, for example, that goes to Turkey, is turned into flour and then exported to other countries. But again, there's a big Russian play here that they're making an argument that the grain is not getting to who it needs to. And I think that is a big element. You can go ahead and dig into this site a little bit more. I'll have the link in the show notes so you can look at exactly, and this site goes in some great detail here, breaks it down, gives you ship voyages here, shows you exactly where everything is going. Take you over to marine traffic and a quick look at the map here. So obviously up here we have the Gulf of Odessa. We can see some images here of some ships that are coming out at this time. Other vessels already heading out at this time. Again, we're seeing vessels moving through this area. But the thing I wanted to note here, the attacks that we've seen in the past. So Snake Island right here off the Danube River, the neutralization of Snake Island was really important so that this fleet of vessels that was coming out of the Danube River using those 2 Ukrainian southern ports was secure. The sinking of Moskva here in the center part of the Gulf of Odessa, the attack on the city of Berdansk up here, the attack on the Kerch Strait, and then the attack of Sevastopol. So what we've seen here is attacks limited in this area, kind of on this arc right here. But what we haven't seen, except for the very beginning of the war, was attacks on ships in the Sea of Azov. We saw some attacks on some vessels early on. They came out of Berdansk and, more importantly, Mariupol. This is why Mariupol was so important to suppress, because of this narrow little strait here that really prevented the flow of these vessels out into the Kerch Strait. We just saw a new decree come out by Russia not allowing any non-Russian ships under the Kerch Strait Bridge. Not that there's a lot of non-Russian traffic going up there to begin with, but you saw that. But now the newest story that has just come out is another drone attack, this time against the port of Novorossiysk. And Novorossiysk on the northern Black Sea coast has become the de facto main base for not just the Russian Black Sea fleet, but also for the movement of cargo out. And when we take a look here at this port, so if you come into the main port here, tankers everywhere, all lined up here, cargo vessels along the berth. And when you come out here into the anchorage, even more vessels. This is the terminus for a long route. So Novorossiysk and the Kerch Straits are really the main areas that we're seeing Russian cargo. This is the story that was put up by H.I. Sutton over Covert Shores about a new drone attack on the port. This is the imagery that he included with his story. I'm going to read just a part of the story here that he has. Trained maritime drones can now reach a Russian Navy base until now regarded as safe. When the drones, USVs, were used to attack Sevastopol on October 29th, they resulted in a major shift in Russian Navy operations. The threat is regarded as so serious that new defenses were added in Sevastopol. They had already put up barriers across the channel. They were using dolphins, marine mammals, to patrol the area. But as the story goes on, and the Russian Navy, which early in the war dominated the Black Sea, barely leaves port. Now this threat has reached another major Russian naval base at Novorossiysk. Local Russian sources have reported that a Ukrainian naval drone has struck the Sanctions oil terminal in Novorossiysk at night. This is strategically important. Now, this oil terminal is really important for a variety of reasons, but it has to be understood that this terminal doesn't just serve as Russian oil, but this is oil that comes out of Central Asia, including Kazakhstan. And we're just not exactly sure what has happened here. So this is the video that shows the attack. Basically see is that small detonation right there. I'm going to go ahead and pull it back here a second so you can see it again. You'll see it right about in this area here. There you go. There is the detonation from it. So what does this mean then in the long term? So, Russian attack on Novorossiysk really gives Russians nowhere else to hide with their fleet. I mean, there's very few bases left. They can head down toward the Georgia coast, but most importantly, this attack on this port, which is a commercial port too, begins to raise the question of these Ukrainian drones potentially targeting other vessels, not just Russian vessels, but foreign flagged open registry vessels that are carrying oil out of the area. And again, one of the things I talked about very early on in this conflict, way back in February and into March, was the potential for the Black Sea to become the Persian Gulf of the 1980s. That was the tanker war. That was when the Iranians and the Iraqis were attacking ships that were moving between ports and areas in the Persian Gulf. It accelerated. It was first the Iranians, then the Iraqis, and it involved neutral forces, and it took a series of years, but eventually dragged the United States into it when we started reflagging Kuwaiti tankers to this. This has the potential to expand. These unmanned surface vessels are controlled by an uplink, probably using the Starlink from Elon Musk to control them via satellite, but very easy for these vessels to go a little stray, out of control, and perhaps damage or sink a vessel that is not involved in the conflict. And where that goes, we don't know. Remember, we're just seeing now attacks in the Persian Gulf on oil tankers. We saw these back in July and August of last year, a series of attacks on oil tankers. We saw that the Iranians were targeting some Israeli vessels too at the time, but here we see this recent attack now on a tanker off the coast of Oman by Iranian vessels. So the dynamics of war is changing again, ever much. And again, I can't say this enough that this is not new. We've seen these styles of attacks before by non-state and state players. We've seen it. Go back to the Barbary Pirates War of the early 1800s. Those were state-sponsored entities. They really weren't pirates. They were more privateers and vessels of the states doing the attacking. So where this goes, we don't know. But the good thing here is the Black Sea Grain Initiative has been extended. We're going to see grain coming out of Ukraine. But remember, for the Russians, the key thing here is that means their food, their fertilizer, and their fuel, except under the price cap, is coming out. We also just saw another thing happen here where Turkey is now mandating a required insurance for all vessels coming through the straits. So the story out of Bloomberg, Turkey adds teeth to Russian sanctions with tanker insurance rule. You heard the UN Secretary General being very nice to President Erdogan of Turkey about Turkey really being the main broker here for this. But what we see right now is that Turkey is warning, according to the story, the world's oil shippers that they will need to prove they're insured to cross the country's vital straits, a move that can restrict the flow of Russian oil as new European sanctions kick in. This new rule starts December 1st. Why is Turkey saying this? Well, the G7 EU price cap goes into effect on December 5th. And there was an issue that I raised, which was really, I'm shocked that this isn't well known, but ships don't have to have insurance to sail. It's really up to the classification society and the owners and the ports they're going into, but they really don't need insurance if they don't. Now, you take a huge liability risk if you don't, obviously. But there was a big fear that because of the price cap, that if the price cap goes into effect and the Russians can't use one of the 13 big P&I clubs that agreed to the price cap, that they would either shift over to another P&I club if they could find one, they would self-insure, or they would sail without insurance. And this is just Turkey sitting there saying, listen, we're not going to let any ships through the straits unless they show proof of insurance. And again, this is the dynamics we're seeing evolving in the Black Sea. And remember, the Black Sea isn't a little cul-de-sac off the Mediterranean that nobody cares about. It is a vital component and contributes into the world's maritime system. We talked about the Mississippi going dry with the river and the impact that has. Well, imagine the Black Sea going dry, not of water, but of shipping coming out. We saw it with Ukraine when it was shut off from shipping from February all the way to July. What happens if the Ukrainians are able to interdict, stop the flow of goods coming out of Russia, out of the Sea of Azov, the Kerch Straits, and Novorossiysk? Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button below, contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon, become a patron of the page. You can adopt a plan that's monthly or yearly, different levels to help the page keep going. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.